Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for coming. Thank you, everybody virtually who's going to tune in. I'm joined by Eric LeMay and Jericho Parms, and I'm going to read their bios just to start, and then talk about the book that gathers this, this particular panel together. Eric LeMay teaches in the writing program at Ohio University. He serves as an editor for Alimentum and Noor and is a host on the New Books Network. He's the author of 3 books, including In Praise of Nothing, a collection of traditional and multimedia essays. Find him at ericlemay.org. Jericho Parms is the author of Lost Wax. Her work has appeared in The Normal School, Hotel America, American Literary Review, Brevity, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts and is a consulting editor at Fourth Genre. Please welcome Jericho Parms. And I gathered these 2 contributors with 53 other contributors in this book, which is Paper Concert, and it's subtitled A Conversation in the Round. And it's basically a dialogue that extends over about a dozen years, and it ranges across topics from class to feminism, racism, climate change is a big thread. And so we bring together all of these conversations via several personal essays that I use to do what I was doing in the original interviews, use my story to connect to the various contributors in one-on-one conversations and in interviews that were published separately. And then I'm putting them all in conversation with one another, which was sort of how the book was taking shape in my head over the years without a conscious decision to do that. And so I'm going to give you an example from the book by reading 2 of the questions that gathered them. And so one of the questions I posed to Eric, and it was, how do metaphors contribute to your modes of thinking? And then Eric's going to answer by reading what he answered in the book.
So I wrote in my conversation with Amy, we all think metaphorically as essayists. It's how we come to understand what our work is and does. Laia Purpura, for example, likens her essays to miniatures, and Ander Monson likens his to hacks. In Montaigne's case, his metaphor is a monster. His essays are like, quote, monstrous bodies, patched and huddled up together of diverse members without any certain or well-ordered figure, having neither order, dependency, or proportion, but casual and framed by chance.
Thank you, Eric.
Sure.
And sometimes the questions immediately followed one another, but this one didn't immediately follow that one. But I asked Jericho, how does the essay follow or resist following your mind on the page? And this is how she answered.
I responded to Amy's question by saying, ideas shape movement, observations shape movement, research shapes movement too. I think of the relationship between research and writing as a merry-go-round where there is both vertical motion and horizontal motion. Information that exists in the world at large can propel a piece while thoughts and images in my own mind bob along, rising and deepening at points, or vice versa. And perhaps like a merry-go-round, an essay might not ever arrive somewhere, but seek instead to journey through texture and sounds, pattern and silences, language, until we step off the ride, slightly dizzy or seeing stars, with some sense of meaning. That said, inevitably some essays resist, or rather insist on cutting a separate path. In those moments, it's up to me to follow, often eagerly, on occasion dragging my feet like a child, but childlike too in my own willingness to be awed, inspired to imagine, be led by curiosity, shaped by whatever happens upon the page.
Thank you, Jericho. So I think you can already hear why I wanted to preserve the answers in those interviews. Even though the interviews were a kind of temporal event, there was a lot of permanent wisdom that was contained in them. And so I got to keep them on the page with that through the form of the paper concert. And so, Eric, would you like to read something from your work that does what paper concert does, and which Jericho nicely articulated for me, which is to find its way through research, through exploration, and to being open to new forms and innovating forms. Will you share one of your works that is similarly innovative in form?
Sure thing. I'd be happy to. And Amy, thanks for putting this together. And Jericho, thanks for being here. And thank you, Matthew, for orchestrating the whole thing. Yeah, so when Amy invited me to do this, she was like, could you just pick a monster essay that you've made? And I thought, okay, well, if Montaigne did that, I can do that. But of course, when I read it, since we need to read in a linear fashion, it will seem smoother than it actually is. So I just want to take a moment to maybe describe what it looks like on the page. So it looks like a patchwork. There are different texts that are interrupting each other alongside one another. A comic might be an approximation, the way that you're not sure which text takes primacy, or Midrash might be another one in which you have the text in the center and then you have the commentary, but often the commentary will overwhelm what's in the center. So, one literary term would be, there's a bunch of paratexts and it's hard to tell which ones are primary. Another thing that's going on, and then there's also white space that I'm hoping gets charged and holds some meaning. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this essay is solve how, in the midst of the pandemic and the other crises that are taking place, where we're getting so much statistical information and data, how we reconcile that with our very personal and human experience of the world, our embodied experience. So one of the texts that's alongside the others is the daily deaths in the US from the pandemic during the month of January. So that's statistical data. And the essay itself is called 1/13/21, or January 13th, 2021, to just signal that it's yet another day in this, endless series of days that we've been in. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm just going to read a couple little snippets, not the whole thing, to just give you a sense. And I'm going to try to break it up a little bit to do justice to what I'm trying to do on the page. But, imagine that it's messier than I will present it. And I think that will help. So January 1st, 2021, 2,557. Daddy's in the hospital. Over the phone, my mother's voice is a cracked and hollow bone. Outside, the moon is buried in clouds. I have never in my life called my father Daddy. This is what my mother does when she can't handle what's happening. She speaks as though I'm a child in a children's story. The one she's telling herself ends happily. This is the winter of the pandemic and 400,000 dead Americans. Stories that begin in the emergency room aren't ending happily. January 7th, 4,079. January 8th, 3,780. As she speaks, I listen for the facts about my father's condition, and they tangle in my head with what I already know. My father is 81. My father has a heart condition. My father and my mother go out every day, sometimes with masks, sometimes not. He walked in and he said, "Jerry, I think I need to go to the hospital." He said he's never felt like this. He was gray, absolutely gray. He said his chest was constricted and he couldn't breathe. The nurse wasn't very nice. It might have been the end of her shift. She said I couldn't stay because of everything. The everything is the pandemic and everything it's done to us, all of us. My mother can't name it because she believes that if she does, then this is it. My father will have the virus and he'll die. January 12th, 4,064. January 13th, 4,022. And that's what I'm thinking. This is it. This is another of the thousands of deaths that are happening every day. And this death will be my father's. He said to me, "Don't tell Eric and Dave," but I thought I should. Eric and Dave, That's me, that's my brother. He said, don't tell us. Now I'm the one who can't handle what's happening. If it were up to my father, my brother and I would be having another night in our endless nights of lockdown. And my father and mother would be going through all of this alone, he in the ER bed, and she in their suddenly all too quiet house. If it were up to my father, the call I'd eventually get from my mother might start, Daddy's dead. January 22nd, 3,980. January 23rd, 3,577. It will take less than 24 hours for me to feel the absurd thankfulness that my father has only gone through a cardiac episode. My father does not have COVID-19. My father will live. He gets tested and retested and goes home the very next day. And it's in those same 24 hours that it strikes me. All of this has been a dry run for his death to come, whether it's from the virus or not, whether it's in the emergency room or not. Nothing is going to change about who my father is, about who my mother is. My father will not want me to know when he is dying until after he's dead. And my mother will tell a story over his dying and his death, one that somehow ends happily. And those of us left will live in the ever after of it all. January 30th, 2,982, January 31st, 2059. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Sort of sitting with that for a minute. I love hearing your work and and thinking about coming together and being in conversation again. I actually found myself going back and reading an interview that you and Amy actually did, I think for Zone 3, and thinking about form and everything we were going to talk about today. I kept kind of mulling over this thing that you had written in or said in response to one of Amy's earlier questions about form. And you have this great answer where you say an essay doesn't come to life until it reaches its readers. This moment when the reader charges the writing with his or her intelligence, memories, cares, biases, quirks is so fundamental to the experience of reading and writing. We usually accept it as a given, a fundament, and we build on it. But so many of your essays, and you were speaking specifically to electronic essays, let us rethink that moment. And I've always loved your work so much as being one of those readers who gets to engage at that moment. But I'm really curious, and hearing you read the piece that you just did and thinking about your work in general and this whole idea of form, when you write so interactive, in such an interactive way, the interactive nature of your work, excuse me, I'm curious if you'd be really willing to talk a little bit more about the actual process that you go through with form and engaging with form. How does your practice engage with, directly or indirectly, your own sense of curiosity? Does curiosity, research, mapping, or constraints of any kind have a seat at the table in the act of writing? Or do you purely sort of follow the process of your mind wherever it goes, or some combination of the two?
Yeah, thanks, Jericho. I love your work too, and I can't wait to hear it. Yeah, you know, the moment when a reader or an experiencer of your work suddenly, you know, brings it into their conscious, brings it into their psyche, if they're reading it out loud, brings it into their body. It's so fascinating to me. And I think as I've gone on in my career, at first I was very interested in kind of making like the perfect work of art that people could come in and appreciate, and it was sort of pristine and complete in and of itself. And as I've gone on, I've been much more interested in the reception, in what people make of the work, in the encounter, in other minds and other art and other bodies that are not my own, and how they experience the world. And I think that, you know, if I had a kind of deep model like Montaigne, or a working model and process like you're asking about, I think it's probably like curation, right? Like that when I create an electronic essay that won't be activated till the reader comes in, or put something together like this that has component parts, that doesn't give someone a clear direction. It's like creating a curated event or gallery space where somebody can walk in and begin bringing their own experiences, their own, creative interests, their own life, and begin filling in the space with what's there. And I think I've moved, to continue with that metaphor, from a curated space that had those placards and maybe you had the headphones to help you through it, to just more and more of an empty room with a few things and lots more space for the people who walk into it. I hope not only to encounter the work that I've left in there, but ideally one another, and what happens as a result of that. And so that's often how I think about a work when I'm doing it. It's when I put these pieces together, does it seem to create the possibilities for a productive experience? And I guess in that sense, it's not too different from museum curation or even game design in some ways, or environment design. But now it's, ambient literature and text, and I hope it creates kind of productive empty spaces, a kind of invitational use of negative space that allows someone to come in and fill it out in ways that I could never imagine. And that to me, I think, is more gratifying than here's this thing that I fully imagined. Now please appreciate it, as we used to say, like Poetry Appreciation Day or something. Yeah, thank you.
That's great.
Eric, could I ask a question?
Sure, I'd love it.
Is there more of this, or do you see this as a one-off piece? The fascination with, and I think this is like our moment, right? Of ticking off the days and thinking through the number of deaths that are going to be COVID deaths, and that there's a sort of overwhelming, of sequencing, and of kind of an endless proliferation of sequencing and numbers. And I found that fascinating, but it made me want to ask the question, is there more of this for you, or is it a freestanding piece?
Yeah, I think the piece is going to be freestanding because I can't imagine how I'm going to enlarge it. It was a way for me to try to deal with that moment of getting the phone call that my father might be dying in a hospital. But I think, the larger question you're asking is the one that I've been asking my fellow writers and artists and trying to teach to, which is, are we in this epoch changing moment where art needs to change? Where we need to make differently and think differently, or are we going to rush back to the ways of making that we did before, March 2020 and everything that's happened? And in these moments, I'm advocating that I think we're in a moment in American and global literature that we should look at in the same way that historically we now look at the Civil War. There was, pre-Civil War American literature and post-Civil War American literature. I'm wondering if we're in that kind of moment, but I think art making needs to be different. I think it needs to reckon with things like statistical numbness, with things like, how do you write systemically? How do you decenter the I that's at so much of American literature and so much of American individualism and the violence that's done? And how do you not look away, right? Like the drive to get back to normal, if American art gets back to normal, I think that's going to be a great disservice to the American public and larger than that as well. So I don't think that this kind of art making I'm done with, but this piece, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very productively. Is ambient literature a term that, you could tell me that you just coined it and I'd go with it, but where did you get that from?
It's a thing. Yeah, it's a genre of few practitioners, but it's the idea that that you might be in an environment where literature is happening and you might only pay attention to some of it at any given time. So, perhaps the most everyday version of that is the scrolling billboard. We read it, we don't, the billboard doesn't care which bit of it you get. But there are artists that are, creating rooms where entire essays will go by on one wall and there'll be pieces on another. And you just walk in and you aren't expected to start at the beginning and read the whole thing as though it were a book on the wall. It's much more like I walk over here and I read a little bit of it. I walk over there. And then this kind of work might be installed in a hallway in a university common space. And some people might just walk through it and never see any of it. And somebody might stop for a moment and look up from checking their phone. And so it's this idea, billboards are another place where this happens. It's around, but you don't have to pay attention to it in the way you might in traditional forms.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll have time to talk more about this stuff, but I'll mute and be quiet again.
Thanks, Matthew.
I definitely do have follow-up questions. If anyone has an immediate follow-up question for Eric, I'll offer a space. And then if not, I'm going to hand it over because I want to hear Jericho read.
Thanks, Amy. So I love that after Eric's reading, he started talking about his processes of curation, and museums are a big theme for me in my work and art, and the whole idea of imagery and what that means to sort of human experience. So I thought I would read today just the first couple of sections of what is actually a quite long braided essay, which now, again, having sort of sat with a lot of Eric and Amy's ideas and words, I'm now thinking of as a braided monster. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about why. But this is a piece called My Paradiso. I'm thinking of shapes, how the snake and curve of a line becomes a figure 8, becomes 2 rings joined, everlasting, never ending. I'm thinking of the letter S and how it is nearly one infinite chain, nearly but not. On my inner wrist, there is a scar, one I've had since girlhood, that looks like something written in sand and partially blown away. I want to conjure the tides, but I'm so far from the ocean as I write that memory spirals away from me. Perhaps whatever follows in these lines I owe to that distance, and to the swimmers and oceanographers, storm chasers and foragers who face the erosion of beauty every day, the alchemy of memory, the elusive real none of us can control. If scars serve as a lighthouse to the past, how do we determine the future? If only memory could expose the path ahead. If only we could receive signals from the moon. In the 1988 film Cinema Paradiso, written and directed by Giuseppe Tornatore, set against the backdrop of an Italian village just after World War II, a young man named Salvador De Vita, along with other townspeople, escaped dark post-war realities by frequenting the village movie theater. The local priest, acting as the moral censor, is ever present, ensuring nothing untoward appears on screen during the films, which he has already screened in advance, demanding that all kissing scenes be edited out prior to their premiere. In Tornatore's film, Salvatore befriends a projectionist, Alfredo, who takes a liking to the mischievous boy, lets him watch movies from the projection booth, and ultimately teaches him how to operate the projector. I befriended a projectionist too. During a long winter, I found myself broke in a small New England town. I worked the concession stand in a 2-screen movie theater on Main Street because financially teaching wasn't enough, and because having recently emerged from a few years of depression and anxiety, I wanted the monotony of shift work, show times, a decorated tip jar, the distraction of a changing marquee. I had just turned 30. I was in love with a man, my partner of several years, but was characteristically reluctant to define that love as I attempted to navigate the push and pull between freedom, independence, and responsibility to others. Although nearing 70, Bill, the theater's main projectionist, had the energy of a young man. He played tennis when he could, told stories about his days in the circus, and crammed into a sedan with his friends and headed to the beach. He loved film more than anyone I've ever known. He grew easily frustrated, in large part because he liked a certain order, timeliness, and took his work as lead projectionist seriously, as craft. But when a film was on and there was time to kill, he talked on end. Bill would routinely pull from the booth his folding chair and position himself next to the concession counter in the tiny house lobby. Although he often had a book and his glasses ready, he rarely made a dent in his reading during our shifts together. Instead, we filled the time with stories from our vastly different lives. Years later, walking the rotunda of New York's Guggenheim Museum, a building that with its monumental spiral design excites my sense of tumbling, my partner and I visit a traveling retrospective of the abstract painter Agnes Martin's work. The exhibition features the artist's serene, sparse, square paintings composed of signature grids, lines, and horizontal bands of color, which carved out her place as one of the few female artists who gained recognition in a male-dominated art world of the 50s and 60s. We start at the top of the Guggenheim sloping gallery and work our way down. My partner, an artist, insists that a top-down approach is the only way to view the museum, so you never tire of the incline, he says. The security guard posted at the top of the spiral confirms the assertion with a stoic but approving nod. Before we turn our attention to the canvases on view, I lean over the inside wall of the museum's rotunda and peer below. The ground level lobby is full of visitors, tourists milling about like dislodged debris in a tide pool. Among them are elderly, school children, and chaperones. Holiday travelers snap photographs. A Japanese tour group follows a docent's raised flag. I see a woman casually rocking a stroller with her foot as she peruses the exhibition catalog before viewing the show. From my bird's eye view, she strikes me as vaguely familiar, but amid the bustle of a museum Sunday, I can't quite determine why. The thing about the letter S that I find so seductive is the negative space it creates. The static start and stop of the line appears as if an invisible thread bound together its ends. Similarly, in good stage productions, we never see the cord that holds the woman flying through the air. Such bold illusion, such sleight of hand. I am thinking of the vocations of women, wondering if I should marry, have children, pursue a landing on the moon. My maternal grandmother, in her quiet moments, painted landscapes and still lifes. My mother, while pregnant with me, flipped burgers by day and made extra money as a seamstress. She later taught elementary school and middle school, art, English, science. I worked in retail, interned in Washington, sold audio tours in a New York art museum, taught college writing courses. Every chance I get, I go elsewhere to try on the term writer, like a dress I've borrowed from a friend that does or does not fit the curves of my shoulders, hips, and spine, the S that binds a body. Before she found painting, Agnes Martin was a swimmer. Although she left her native Saskatchewan when she was young, she recalls the landscape was so flat you could see the curvature of the earth. Martin grew up in Vancouver, where she swam daily and excelled in her high school swim team. In 1936, when Berlin hosted the Olympic Games, she nearly qualified for the Canadian national team. At the Guggenheim, I walk from one canvas to the next and imagine Martin swimming. The splash of her arms cutting the surface, her body gliding, leaving lines in her wake. I imagine her in the aquamarine lanes of a pool, completing lap after lap, her breath steady as she releases a deliberate exhale with each stroke, with each stroke. Just across the park at the Natural History Museum, a massive model of a blue whale hangs on display, its neck grooved with horizontal lines. At 94 feet and over 20,000 pounds of fiberglass, the replica was based on a female whale found off the coast of South America in 1925. Though they've been hunted to near extinction, the blue whales are the largest of animals alive today. They have a haunting deep song that can be heard hundreds of miles away, a gentle intelligence, a majesty and patience to them that reminds me of Martin herself. Martin, who never wavered from her own artistic vision, who ultimately sought solitude away from the art scene of New York City. At the theater, Bill shows me how to work the projector. 2 wheels are stacked to form a figure 8, an S fully realized. Bill's hands move steadily, keeping track of all the details. He removes a spool of 35mm film from a flat canister and threads it into the projector. Once loaded, the film moves seamlessly, like the tide. Over the industrial hum, Bill explains the timing of the reels, how years ago, when films came in multiple reels, projectionists used to mark the spools with cigarette burns, cue marks, to signal the particular reel was nearing its end, that it was time to prepare the next. The marks, while not insignificant, largely went unnoticed, invisible to a viewer's naked eye, a viewer otherwise immersed in a visual experience. What we don't look for, we don't see, Bill says in a professorial tone. As he moves, I search for shapes in the liver spots on his skin. Skin, another S that connects us all, or doesn't. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jericho. I'm always just dazzled by your work. It's so, you know, there's this idea, this description of the essay as the mind in motion. And you have these arcs of thought, but then they're so bound into a sensual rootedness in language, into this kind of experiential underground river that runs through everything. This is the kind of gushing I do when I talk about you to my students. So I'm gonna be a little bit more formal in this question that I'm gonna ask you, but it does come up. So the question or the problem that sometimes I encounter with younger essayists, and I put it like this, it's like, how can you not be boring? How can you actually be engaging about the things that you want to talk about, right? And so, you know, I imagine just in the example that you read us, like somebody's like, well, you know, there's this movie I want to talk about, and there's this guy I met named Bill, and, you know, I love Agnes Martin, and, you know, we went to the Guggenheim, and have you ever thought about the letter S or where whales? You know, like there are these cool facts, and I'm just like, too much. You know, this can't be done. And then I'm like, no, it actually can be done, and it's beautiful. So you have this talent, which is that you can take stuff, I think content that could potentially be deadly, right? Like Wikipedia content, not the personal stories, but like some of the facts. And somehow you get this energy and you transform it. And I think a more sophisticated way I could observe this is that you take something that might be intrinsically interesting, but you also give it its own interest in its own life within the circuitry and tissue of your essays. So that Agnes Martin might be tremendously powerful, but it's Agnes Martin within Jericho's essay, and it takes on its own energy that then begins kind of swirling up with the other pieces, the personal stories, the family history, the way in which you talk about the movie. And so I'm curious in terms of your own, to me, it almost feels like a lyric movement that you have going on. It's as though it's cultural criticism and personal memoir and social observation and natural history, but it's all wrapped within a kind of lyric poem that we don't know is happening, that gives it this energy that is always sort of spectacular for me. So I'm just curious, how do you do that? Right? How do you take this material that could be disparate, that could be flat, and instead you create these ways in which it's all alive and it's all together. The way you start at the ocean and you return to the ocean, but we could have never imagined getting there with Agnes Martin or through a giant suspended whale, and the piece, you know, coheres in all these wonderful ways.
Thank you, Eric. It's a lot to hear. So it's funny that you started with how do you said something like, how do you do that and not be boring, right? And to me, it's so interesting because I think what first brought me to the essay as a form like of writing period, you know, years ago was, you know, I had studied journalism and I had sort of been interested in art, and, you know, I thought I was and travel. I wanted to like travel around and tell the stories of the world and make the world a better place. And And that was a lofty goal and great. But then I realized, no, there's actually a lot I need to figure out, like between my heart and my head and my life, right? And I recognized that I needed to understand a little bit more about my own story, a little bit more about my own sort of perspective on the world. And when I started to think about writing in that way, I would sit down, I would try to write like an experience or a memory, and the concept of narrative, like a traditional A to B narrative, would bore me to tears. Like I would just say, who cares? I did this and this experience happened and this experience happened. And for me, it was like, why does that mean? Where is the meaning in that experience? Why does that, resonate for anybody else to read? And so I really struggle myself with the sort of traditional narrative, and narratives can, beautiful narratives can be crafted with incredible arc and structure and utilizing form in different ways. So I have utmost respect for writing that really does follow more traditional narrative paths. For me as a writer in my own process, it was like, I literally couldn't get to the next part of an experience without thinking about what it was related to or what it reminded me of, or like trying to pull in the other pieces. And sometimes it is too much, right? Like for a lot of readers, like that's going to be too much. For me, I think of it as, and again, just to kind of go back to my roots in museums and thinking about sort of the encyclopedic nature of museums that really encompass so many stories. And yet you can find a way to walk through a museum and be reminded of the gallery that you just went through, or, something sort of associates a new question or a new inquiry. That to me is really my process. It's a mess, and why I said that I love, having now your word monster in my ear is because there is a braid, right? This essay goes on for, a little while longer, and there is a braid, there is a form to it, and there is a narrative, right? There is a story that is a thread throughout the whole piece, and it is a story of my relationship with Bill, and it has an arc, right? And there's an end to that, and so that's a component of it. But when I say like it's a braided monster, I think of the braid as a place to start. So you think of your various components, you might start to, make that braid, pull it all together. Maybe it's a nice and neat, like a, beautiful, whatever plait, if you will, crisp plait. I want the braid that's like you've run the marathon and your braid's all messy, right? Like you don't necessarily see that it's a braid underneath. There's so much else, but there's something underlying or holding it together. I remember being young when like all my friends started, everyone wanted to perfect like the messy bun, right? Like it's supposed to look messy, but like people spend a lot of time making it look messy like that. This just happened to be one example that came to mind. But so I think about having to hold sort of the abundance of ideas, images, information, often needing to sort of bring myself back to earth a little bit and be willing to shave off or eliminate and simplify. Most of my drafts start like, it's just an insane dump of information and thoughts and questions. And then it's sort of a process of chiseling away, starting to find the commonalities. In this piece, S as a thing to come back to. You want to plant those reminders to the reader, like I'm asking you to go in this direction now, but I'm not going to remind you of the few other things that we've already mentioned. So ideally, you're giving your reader just enough of those kind of landmarks along the way that they can find themselves and not get entirely lost. That's the hope, at least.
Thank you for that answer. When you're doing that process of chiseling down and seeing what you've got, is that for you analytic? Are you like color coding and saying this goes here and this goes there, or is it an intuitive feel as you begin to read the revision? It starts to sound right or associate right. I mean, how does that process register for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is kind of tonal or thinking about like what various associations for me convey, not necessarily say, but convey. So thinking about Martin and the connection to the whale, for example, there's something kind of both weighted and water-based, and thinking about sort of the intangible qualities of the different images that I might bring into a piece is just as important as actually thinking about the information. So you're right, like some of it could be very basic research, like on the Wikipedia level, right, of just information. But if it adds to some slight, widening or layering of meaning, that to me is kind of the litmus. If it's just there because I think it sounds nice and it seems pretty or whatever, that doesn't serve the ultimate purpose. So I always think of form and content needing to kind of be in a marriage or collaborate in order to or ultimately share the same goals of a piece, if that makes sense. Kind of serve.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I think that one of the ways I think about your work is that it goes from the informational to the evocational, and something emerges on the page that is different from, anything that could be reduced to, say, research, research in nonfiction. Well, thank you, Jericho. I'm gonna let other people ask you questions about that, because that was so great.
Jericho, I have a question for you. And that's what happens, particularly Eric talking about the that interaction that happens when a reader, or in this case a listener, me, is interacting with the essay. Is Cinema Paradiso, well, you were talking about how the essay goes on. So I'm kind of curious about how you wrap up the essay. Or if you do, because of this, I love this S and how you found it in the film projector, for example, and elsewhere, as this sort of leitmotif that runs through the piece. And the way in which an S is not a zero, so it doesn't, or an O, it doesn't come back around. It just is a snake as you play with it. But I was personally hooked in by Cinema Paradiso because I really have strong memories of having watched that movie in a theater. And of course that somehow becomes talismanic now, because we so often, or at least I so often, experience a movie in a theater, with other people communally now, with COVID. And my wife at the time cried while watching Cinema Paradiso, and she's not that way, so that's like, if you said, was there another moment where she cried in public while watching a movie where a lot of her was probably engaged with this has been, the rep on this movie is that you break down and cry because it's really sentimental, and I'm not going to do that because I'm a poet and an artist, but she did. and it's a very beautiful film, and it's a strong memory for me. So of course I'm waiting for Cinema Paradiso or somehow all of this to come back and connect with your relationship with the projector, Bob, I think his name is. And so, so what happens? I mean, I'm still that kind of reader, what happens?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's quite a bit, so the essay sort of unfolds, and the relationship with Bill is explored a bit more. And ultimately, we get to the more present day of an essay. Like I kind of look back, and Bill has since passed. He had an illness and ended up ending his life. And so there's that theme of loss and sort of how to continue on or have hope in the face of, illness, all that. The Cinema Paradiso thread sort of follows along and keeps kind of adding just on the informational level. I would say the Cinema Paradiso thread adds information and adds imagery. And I keep coming back to the image of Salvatore, the boys sitting in the theater, and their sort of boyish, childlike energy at like the kind of what I'm looking for, like the risque, like the possibility for the risque, right? Or they know they're missing something, and they have these like, bouts of frustration in their seats, and they're all like big ears, and so I do a lot with sort of the imagery of the children themselves. And so with both of those, the loss of Bill and then the image of the children wanting, like struggling to regulate their own bodily desires, right? To understand how humans interact and what's to come, in their adolescence and around love and sex and all of that. I'm sort of playing around with themes of desire, of connection to people, of loss. The question of being married and being a mother is sort of a theme in all of the essays I've been working with, and these do come together in a collection. So there's sort of a broader context here. But I really use the Cinema Paradiso piece to ground in that sort of childlike wonder, childlike desire, and have that that thread of the piece kind of speak to those themes. And because it's a film, I can just, the very last paragraph of this piece talks about imagining being in the body of a whale, just to go back to the whale image, and thinking about spreading my fingers through the baleen walls and through, a lover's hair. And then I say, no, let me rewind and begin again. I would rather sit in the projection booth as Salvatore and his friends, his squirming friends, giggle through footage of film-worthy kisses, one image after the next, embedding in their memory each dramatic embrace, assuring them that there is more out there to crave, infinite evidence of love, not galaxies away, but here on Earth. So I sort of use their sort of moment of experiencing the spliced together imagery to sort of parallel what I'm trying to express in terms of emotion in that ending. I realize it's totally out of context, so hard to kind of see how it comes together. But
yeah, no, given that I remember the film really well, it makes sense to me. Thank you for the detailed explanation.
Let's let Eric ask a question, who has his hand up.
Hi, y'all. I've been in the dark over here, obviously, but really enjoying listening to how you're approaching this. And I think I have a comment question for sort of all of you. One thing that in reading Amy's paper concert and in hearing y'all talk about form that I'm really thinking about is how we can resist linearity in terms of form, right? So like ambient immersions in text, like you're talking about, Eric, or like resistance to braids as like a formal sort of plat are resistances to linearity in a certain way. At least for me, that's what it sounds like we're doing. But I'm also confronted with, the like book object, right? So like we are like writing sentences in a sense because we're expected to write in prose, right? So I'm kind of wondering, in terms of hybrid forms and linearity, where y'all draw inspiration from? Like, what are you thinking about moving into next in those questions and conversations? I love the idea of like essay as exhibits or sort of public engagement that we've been bouncing around. So like Jericho said, so I guess that's kind of an amorphous question, but I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to those ideas more.
We all do.
Yeah.
I could offer a few quick things, that I'd love to hear what Amy and Jericho say. I think, the idea of the linear narrative, or even, to the narrative with the traditional beginning, middle, and plot that the linear narrative presupposes in many cases, the kind of, archetypical entertainment narrative. I mean, the Western linear narrative of progress we now see is going to lead us all to destruction. So maybe a different kind of form to go in there. I've also noticed I have a son who's just turned 6, and I've noticed that he has just a kind of emotional and bodily resistance to linear narration, with the tensions that it brings in, with the expectations, with not knowing what's going to happen, all that rising action stuff that we think of, or how will it end, that Matthew was asking about Jericho's essay, that there's nothing natural about that. right? That it's, it might even be a kind of narrative to which people with high cortisol and adrenaline levels are addicted, as we are in the West. What's going to happen? Can it be more intense? Can it be more exciting? Can it give me a greater hit? Whereas, if you think of kind of natural narratives, they're cyclical, right? They're the seasons that come and go. They're the days that come and go. And narratives, children's stories that use that rhythm, there are certain Asian structures that work like that. He's fine to hear, right? Like something changes, something comes back again, like that's fine. So I'm kind of curious, like seeing a body that and a psyche that hasn't been exposed to linear narration get exposed to it and have a natural aversion has been very, very, I don't know, illuminating for me in thinking about the larger importance of linear narration in the West and progress and, the story of our lives that we're marching forward on and all that sort of stuff. That maybe there's something deeply toxic about that linear narration, and that, most the ways are a better way to go. But yeah, so there's a few thoughts. Thanks for the question.
I might jump in here just because I think it's almost, we assume that that's how narratives work, right? Because we inherit a structure and then we just try to plug everything or understand everything into, a traditional Freytag's pyramid or something. And then it's largely kind of masculine form. That's the sort of the hero's quest is to some extent that the tension and the drama of that. And then I was interested when Jericho was reading and thinking about why do we need new forms to some extent, because there aren't that many feminine forms. And they, there's been some dialogue about that, but just expanding the conversation was what interested me with Paper Concert, and bringing in just across different disciplines and across different areas of expertise, authorities that we have established authorities who have published many books and won awards and things like that. And then one of my favorite people that I spoke to was my librarian, who has since retired at the local university, who had never been interviewed before. And so she spoke really authentically from her heart when I spoke to her. And so I just think that linear narrative is such a limited it's such a limited form. We have to, like many of our forms that we've inherited. But I'll let Jericho speak.
Yeah, no, I love this question and everything that's been said. And, I think there's so much space and room to take on that very question and to push further, even where we are in time and space right now, that like the amount that people are talking about time right now, time's been sort of morphed, right? Like the past 2-3 years, and people are talking about time in this different way, where it's like, oh, I don't even know if it's Tuesday or Wednesday, or like what year that was, or, we've all kind of been thrown into a slightly different space where I think time has been, we're interrogating it a little bit differently. And, I like to think about memory in the same way. A lot of the work that I do happens to be writing and incorporating memory. Memory has never been a linear thing, in my opinion. I love work. Anytime a work says, wait, I don't think I remembered that right, or wait, and I remembered it this way, and then someone else remembered it this way, right? Like anytime there's that element of self-interrogation or interrogation to our relationship to experience, I think that opens up dimension and depth in writing. So I think, what if we do move into this place where it's not about what happened, but what it meant, right? What we learned, what are the open-ended questions we can ask, as opposed to what happened next, or what happened in the end, or how did that conclude? And I think it takes a willingness, to speak to Amy's, point about, whether that's a feminine or resisting sort of a more masculine or authoritative approach to the work or to craft, an opening of a little bit of humility and a little bit of willingness to not know, right? Willingness to follow the curiosities as opposed to have the answers. I mean, all of that, I think, really contributes to the boundlessness of form. If we can sort of get our minds, around that concept of the not knowing, the not having the answer, the not having the clear path. I think there's a lot of rich writing yet to be done as more writers, step into those spaces.
Yeah, thank you all for those answers. And I have a follow-up if I can ask it. I don't want to like hog too much, but y'all were making me think in a couple of ways about binary forms. So, you know, like the opposition of a masculine versus a feminine sort of narrative, you know, masculine being more linear in certain ways. Because I'm also interested in sort of the forms that are being identified as sort of external to those dualities, like queer forms and queered ways of approaching narrative. So I also sort of heard Eric saying natural form, which made me think of natural as in maybe opposition to like technological or technical form in terms of like how we consume media. But I'm also not sure that that's really, they're really in opposition all of the time. So I was wondering, I guess, Eric, like specifically, do you think of those two things as different? Do you think of them relatedly? I'm thinking that like the way we consume narrative on like TikTok or something is like a little bit rhizomatic or natural in certain ways, right? Like things pop up, things go away. There's not always a direct point. So maybe I'm seeing them as kind of natural, which feels like a place to sort of dig in, but I don't know if you've been thinking about that too.
Yeah, I guess I love your question of like, you know, if we're thinking about forms and structures as gendered, what could be illuminated by suddenly thinking about non-binary queer possibilities, right? And maybe one place to go is to look to the natural world to see for alternatives off of something like a highly constructed and historically specific binary, like the gender binary. So, you know, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's come across this, that the Freytag's pyramid model is based on like the male orgasm, right? Building tension, rising, and then you have the climax, and then there's a quick denouement, and you know, you go and have pizza or something like that. And then like Virginia Woolf comes back, and like the ways, it's like female pleasure is different. It's this return, and each time it comes back, it grows. You know, there's criticism on this. So if I'm sounding crazy, I'm not the only crazy person out there, although I think critics are not the person you say, look, I'm sane. So one of the great benefits, I think, to all of us for queerness is other kinds of pleasures, if we want to continue that model. But then also just thinking outside of, you know, the binary, the gender binary is all typically based in, you know, a kind of biological notion of male and female based on reproductive organs and a simplistic idea of them in and of itself. So both the natural world can be a kind of resource for thinking what different structures exist outside of human structures and outside of historically manufactured structures. But then also, I think, you know, with queerness and queer consciousness, you suddenly have, if narrative is a form of pleasure, if structure is a form of pleasure, what are the other kinds of pleasures that we might map through and embody in form and structure that have yet to be named because of the dominance of the traditional male-female gender binary as it arose in the 17th and 18th century. So that's a little bit. Does that help, Eric?
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like a complicated matrix of questions, but I like one way of seeing it as like the question of pleasure in narrative at the center. So like if we're framing some of this in that way, right, or consuming it in that way, it's kind of interesting to think about it. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Another way I can't help thinking of is the binary of the individual versus the collective, as opposed to what I've come to understand as the individual as a collective, especially through the book. That was one of the reasons why I was interweaving my memoir essays with the larger conversation with people who have very much shaped how I think about the world in various ways, not necessarily an echo of it, but contrasting a lot of times. And David Haskell provided a really nice illustration. Eric, you used the word rhizomatic. I mean, he's the forest, he's a biologist, spent a lot of time in the woods and has written a lot about being in the woods, and was really thinking about, that underground network, but also, just the unseen connections between people, between different communities, which is like the invisible thread that Jericho was speaking to. I mean, I think there's all of these invisible threads underlying things, which happens to remind me actually of the thread that starts. For those of you who don't know Paper Concert, I thought I would just start a little bit with the reading, unless we have a follow-up question to Eric's. I'll just read, just so you'll know how it opens. Outside the window by my writing desk grows a fringe tree. For years prior to acquiring this view, I lived in apartments, my desk turned toward a wall, my ears plugged against the cries of sirens. So this fleecy white foliage often charms my gaze between taps of the keyboard. One day in late summer, I noticed a strand of spiderweb blowing from a high branch. Sunlight snagged the silk just right, so it glistened like a silver hair before vanishing into the distance. It was caught on something, but there was nothing for it to reach in that direction except the roof of my house, over 15 feet away. I stood to investigate and saw that the line connected to the eave over a chasm hundreds of times the length of a large spider. The silk was slack to accommodate wind, but like Philippe Petit's tightrope between the twin towers, it spanned a space that was both terrifying and laughable. I imagine the spider realized her folly after stringing that anchor line and gave up, exhausted, but I admired the ambition. A web that broad could have netted dragonflies from the Carboniferous period with their 3-foot wingspans. I wondered if the spider embodied some ancient memory of that era or just had a tremendous appetite. I returned to my desk to work. And so some part of the image of the spider, which if you've been in Tennessee, we have these amazing orb weavers constantly distracting me when I'm teaching, and I see them stringing a line from one building to the next. It's not unusual that it's a 20-foot silk strand. And so I thought it seemed like the perfect metaphor for these conversations that stretched over decades and across different subject matter. And so the questions just range from, the question that I ask the most often is, when in your life have you felt the freest? And so I ask that of a bunch of different people. If you pick up the book, that's sort of the anchor line in it. But I think that this one by Alison Hawthorne Deming might get us thinking a little bit about form, because I ask her if all art equally exemplified an imperative toward form, or how do different works kind of relate to form. And she said, she was talking about poetic forms like the sonnet and the villanelle and the sestina and things like that, and how they reminded her, like Eric suggested, to variety in leaf and flower form. So in the natural world, going to that. And she also thinks of the expressionist paintings of de Kooning and Pollock and Rothko. And she thinks that they're perfectly matched with the 20th century's interest in the theory of relativity and quantum dynamics, imprecise and yet speaking of an underlying truth and imperative toward form and the dissolution of form. And then she closes by saying, Stravinsky said, if you give me form, you give me freedom. All art teeters on the edge of that paradox. And it seems to me, so what is the 21st century going to be? What forms are going to be compelled by the nature of the pandemic and the stresses of that? So it just seems like we've got to ask these questions. But Jericho, did you want to answer back to the question? Did I cut you off from answering? Was it Eric's question?
No, I not necessarily, but I have lots to say after what you've just read and said, and on all these topics. I mean, so many things are in my head right now. One of the things I was just thinking about, well, I'll say to the previous question, I think anything that engages with, again, to sort of speak to any ambiguity, any sort of, I write a lot about a biracial, experience and my positioning between whiteness and blackness, and, thinking about identity in that way and all of its intersections, I think is just, it's so crucial to find the freedom, whether that's in form or something else, because without it, we can't add to those, the human experience as written, right, then we need to. So I think all of this, I feel passionately about in so many different ways. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation. In speaking to what Amy, you just said, I was going to say the descriptions of the spider, the web, the threads. I often go back to whenever I'm stuck, whenever I'm not even sure where to begin, almost certainly I find a point of entry through observation and through description, because that will inherently get me to something that only I am seeing and only I can articulate, right? And so I think whether that's observation in nature, as you were describing, whether that's observation just sitting in front of a painting or a sculpture and looking until your eyes hurt and describing until you can't find any words, and then pushing yourself to find more words, and seeing what, how you expand the lexicon of your own work. To me, there's a lot of power in that process. And I have found different ways of kind of navigating around form just through the process of, unbridled just attention and commitment to that level of attention. And in Allison's response, she mentions abstract expressionists, and I did some of my thesis work in my graduate program was looking at abstract expressionism and the essay as a form, and where were there intersections there. And to me, I feel like I reached a new level of understanding the potential for the essay through understanding really what artists were doing in terms of breaking out of the traditions that they had come from. So it was a very rambling comment that was attempting to speak to various things that have come up, but I'll leave it there.
No, that was beautiful, and a wonderfully visual illustration of exactly the kinds of experiments in form that essays do, but nicely by Agnes Martin, whose beautiful abstract pieces. And also Hilma af Klint is my sort of go-to abstract expressionist, but yeah, we can see what they're doing with breaking wide open the field of form. So I have lots of questions. If does anyone want to jump in from the audience before I start? Because I just wanted to think about, in general, what innovations in form we're looking for culturally, societally. What are the kinds of questions that can't be asked about a global pandemic because we don't have a form broad enough to ask that question? I mean, that's already a form that's been a question that's been generated by what Eric read, but what are some other big questions and areas of expression that you all have not seen a form for, or that you've seen a form that's starting to provide a medium for a conversation that you want to have?
Well, I think that earlier Eric sort of slid a little bit into the rise of games as a form, and stuff that used to be called Second Life, or now we've got meta, and how to even conceptualize this emergence of game form, really, as a kind of master organizer, and how it plays out now with the virtual. I mean, these, I'm doing my best to formulate the question, but that's an area that interests me. I can remember the semester, we were just talking about it, the semester of the spring, for me, the spring semester of 2020, when I was teaching 2 classes, and I had one class fully online and I had one class in person. And I was telling my in-person class that I knew that we were going to end virtually online, but that, I was at some degree of how to do it. I was trained, I had some form for it. I had the other class and I was just going to migrate you guys over, but not to worry. I had some sense of how to handle it. And it was a class on Shakespeare and the Anthropocene, actually. And I had this essay from the 1990s called Psychosis in Cyberspace. And then all of a sudden we're reading it, 20 plus years later. And there's this phrase, kind of like we were talking about ambient literature. And the phrase was the final amputation. And for this, Sheila Kunkel is the writer of this piece, that the final amputation is in that binary sort of Derridian slide, when you amputate the real life you and you just live fully in the virtual you, and that would be the final amputation. And so she was sort of seeing this in 1995, 96. And I was asking my students, is this the final amputation? Right now, have we lived long enough to see it? So I guess I've been thinking about that ever since. Vincent J reacted. There's this. I'm sorry, I'm looking up if other people want to go. It says Vincent J reacted, but that's not connected to this one.
Yeah, there's always this kind of, if you kind of look at the history of Western literature, it's always the end time. And have we hit finally the real one, after the end of history and all that. I like that a lot. I think about that in the context of a conversation I was having with a colleague who is a post-colonial and now decolonial theorist who grew up in Etria. And we were talking about kind of, what's after this, after postmodernism or after this kind of digital turn. And he sort of said, well, Eric, the way it's helpful for me to think about it is that postmodernism is really a reaction to the West recognizing a colonial reality of itself. There's no meaning, but it's not, but that's a particular Western crisis that, if you just look outside of its narratives, is not happening universally, but the West likes to project itself universally. So postmodernism is a crisis of apparent meaning, that's the West's reaction to post-colonialism and, a different set of voices coming in. To which I say that maybe the forms that we need are the ones that are foregrounding other voices, and we're starting to get that. So a very concrete example I think of is Kiese Lemon's Heavy, this memoir that came out, which is just amazing. And he's talked about it in very specific ways. So it's epistolary. He's writing as an African-American son to his African-American mother. And, as he said in many interviews, no one had done a memoir like this. So it's destroying the memoir as it's been published before. It's doing an end run around the kind of default white male gaze that, is lodged in publishing. And he's doing auto theory. So he's both telling the story of his own growing up, but he's also writing from the present and kind of doing a structural analysis of what he was being exposed to and what kinds of social forces were running through, his classroom when he was in 8th grade. And so there are wonderful passages of here is what it's like to be in my 8th grade classroom in Southern Mississippi. But then I'll talk about, a set of key terms that if we had only had back then, our lives would have been entirely different, like neo-Confederatism, like systemic injustice, that every day, I can't do the quote exactly right, but every day our lives were shaped by those and we couldn't speak it, is something like that. So it might be that the forms that we have are really about listening to voices we haven't heard yet, and they will be emergent. Those might be indigenous voices, those might be voices of people that have traditionally not had a chance to articulate the forms that might speak most powerfully to them, or to reinvent the forms that have served particular audiences and readers.
You said that about indigenous voices, and I happen to have here one
Yeah.
of the moved to me, the shapes of native nonfiction, and it's just it's very much speaking to that question. And both of you in your readings had in common this idea of creating space, making space. Jericho, you talked about the negative space within the S as kind of like a container for holding on to something. And Eric, you talked about white space. And so I wonder if you want to speak to how form is specifically using and creating space.
Yeah, I love that that question. And I just want to just have one reflection as Eric was talking about KSA's layman's work. He has also written in beautiful terms about the idea of revision, and like revision as love, revision. I can't think of the exact quote at the moment, but it's one that I go back to, because the idea that, again, it hasn't all been written as set in stone written, right? Like we go back, we have to revisit, we have to re-see things. And, you know, to tie this to Amy, the question you just asked, for me, form is that way of doing that, to make space for the changing mind, or the new learned thing, or the new perspective, or the shift in light, or whatever it is that's going to change the idea, the experience, the narrative. I believe form can hold all of that change within a given piece or a given book. And there's a richness to that. There's a you know, I think space is one way that I'm currently seeing that, as form kind of being, yes, a container, but a container with like the doors and windows all open for that like breath of air, right? Because without a certain movement, writing, for me at least, becomes very static very quickly. And I want to see it, you know, that rhizome, or I want to see that spreading and that movement. And to be engaging in conversation. And one of the reasons I think the paper concert works so well is that you never quite know until you hear the next voice, right? Like there are conversations and there are threads of conversation, and you can follow those. But in some ways, it's that collective, it's all the voices, and making space and room for those. I love when you earlier said seeing the individual as a collective, you know, to me is a really powerful concept that that I think we can all learn a lot from. So many good questions here.
Thank you. Thank you. Eric, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I love that, Jericho. And I think, you know, the idea of making space means that others can enter into that space if the work has an invitational quality, if it's not the author as authority speaking. And, you know, we've all become acutely aware over the past few years that we can't speak or assume for the person next to us what their reality might be, what they're going through. And one of the things that I so deeply admire about Amy's work and the book that she's made is that it solves a problem that comes with that, right? Which is that if there's not space for others, if there's not an invitation, then you're all alone, right? And like traditionally writing it's very lonely, right? We're there, we're working on our things by ourselves. And one of the beautiful things I think one of the things that's amazing about Amy's book is it's like one of the least lonely books in American literature that I can think of, right? Because it brings everybody in. It says we're not alone, we're interconnected. The nature of this work is such that one person did not make it, that we are making this together, which is of course how Amy is a literary citizen too. But it's just suddenly you see like there's such a cost that comes with the singular author creating his, her, their work by themselves and then putting it out there versus this model of we create space, we co-create, we collaborate, and suddenly the self is no longer lonely and there's true connection and the work is something more beautiful than if any one person had done it. And so it's one of the things that Amy's taught me that I'm trying to bring forward in my own work.
Thank you for saying that, Eric. That may well be the push of the pandemic against loneliness. If we're going to, respond to anything from this time, isolation is going to have to be a factor, in addition to terror and, all of the complications of information and who controls that information, who has access to that information. Those are other things. But I think that loneliness is a deep, it's definitely a deep influence. Does anybody else want to speak to that or anything else?
I just was kind of reminded of, similar to Paper Concert, I'm excited to see more writers starting to break open that sort of single voice, single writer approach. I think about Patrick Madden's book, Disparates. He has a series of essays where he actually invited other essayists to have little cameo appearances. And it was a fascinating process, like to be invited in to interrupt somebody else's work with your own, take on laughter or whatever the theme or the topic was. It's this other, to me, I think what the intangible part of this is that there's real empathy, I think, in a process like that. There's generosity, there's again, an openness to just breaking the mold, right? Like that has a lot of power, I think. And I've just, Paper Concerts is a great example of just the power that can be contained with a multitude of voices, and contains not even the right word, collected, curated, right? It's really exciting to see more of those kinds of projects taking off.
Curated does seem like the word. I mean, I'm also thinking of Just Us, the American Conversation, Claudia Rankine. I put the link to Madden's book and to maybe Jericho, that was the revision quote. I'm hoping to read that afterwards that you said about key essays, revision and love. So rich, absolutely rich. Thank you all so much. We have, I think, 5 more minutes. Is that right, Matthew? Okay, I have some more questions, but I do want to make sure that the audience can participate. If you have anything that you all want to add, I want to give you all first dibs on the questions.
Well, my only other question, you mentioned the librarian who had never been interviewed before. And is there another contributor that right now is in your mind in a special way that you would share with me and the other participants in the panel right now?
I think one of the most rewarding parts about interviewing anyone is calling attention to them. So one thing is calling attention to, I had heard Philanie Slaughter is the librarian, and she was Native American. And so we had had a lot of classes where she was talking about seed saving and the Three Sisters gardens and things like that. And I knew she was an expert, but I got to lift her up as part of the conversation in the book. And so I've had the great joy of getting to lift up some of my former students. And I know you all who teach understand that when you see your students go on and write something or make something that they're proud of and that you're proud of, and that you get to call attention to it, whether it's to invite them back to the school and show their work, or let them read from their chapbooks or something like that. But Raven Jackson is one of the contributors to the book that I just was especially pleased to be able to include. Also, Sugar LaFay was another one of my students. So getting to include the students and add them to the authorities that I consulted for other questions really felt special to me.
Thank you. No, there's no sin in ending early. If we're all talked out, we're all talked out. But
Erica, I might ask you if your students did anything interesting with form based on the fact that I think you taught in a graduate seminar paper concert. And I was just curious if what form you all are seeing students use, because I think they're openings.
Yeah, so I did a graduate workshop that was basically responding to the crises. Like that was the theme, because all these young writers were just exhausted and overwhelmed, as many of my peers that I've talked to are exhausted and overwhelmed. And so I brought in Amy's work as one model for a different way of moving forward. And we looked at her book alongside some other examples of collaboration. And then I just asked them to go off and work together. And so they did things like interviewed one another, or one of them produced text and the other one produced image, despite the fact that the person who produced the image couldn't draw, right? So they came up with these ways of supporting and working with one another. And the big response back was that this overwhelming burden of how am I going to write in the middle of all this? I'm exhausted, what I have to say that can't mean anything in light of so much that has to be addressed. Suddenly when there was somebody there with you, it was like, well, we'll just do something. And so the ground shifted from the impossible task of writing a work that responds to the moment to here I am. And I introduced it or framed it around something that Amy had alerted me to, which is the idea of deep play, and how even in the midst of the crisis that we're in, that bringing this attitude and this comportment of deep play to the work allows you to go on, that's not a shirking of responsibility, but a getting in touch with the human capacity that we need for art making. And so yes, off they went to play together and collaborate. And it came back and we did something, was kind of the great thing, that it's still possible to create art. So I have Amy to thank for that. Thank you, Amy.
That we can create together in the midst of this. That's a beautiful note to end on. So
yeah,
thank you. Thank you all again so much. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. This was really a wonderful panel.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that we were able to record it. And why don't you hold up again paper concerts, and so that we can see it all and celebrate it for a moment as a collective, a novel collective exercise that will hopefully produce more of its like in strange and surprising ways.
I love that. I hope so.
Yeah, me too. Well, we've got, if you're, for those of you that want more of this, we've got a panel on creative nonfiction that's going from what, 1 to 3:30. Is that correct? And then Tom, who hopefully I'm not putting on the spot, will be reading from 3:30 to 4:30 as our virtual keynote. So I encourage you to, and Tom is a very good practitioner of the essay form himself. So yeah, the online program, I'm looking at it now, is 1:30 to 3 o'clock. Yeah, Billy Clem from Wabanse Community College, and he organized that panel the way in which Amy, you organized this one, and I know it's on creative nonfiction, memoir type stuff. And then we've got Tom's reading at 3:30, and then we go on to the in-person stuff. So, and hopefully you, if you're if you have a chance, hopefully next year we'll be able to do the in-person thing, and I'll be able to meet you guys in person.
That would be great. Hopefully we'll see you all at the virtual panels. Be well.
Okay, take care
Thanks,
now.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.